Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. Did you know that the Campaign for Historic Trades, which is powered by Preservation Maryland, is the sponsor of 3 registered apprenticeship programs? The campaign also hosts workshops across the nation, maybe even one in your backyard. Visit historictrades.org to learn more and find a way to learn a trade. This is Nick Redding. You are once again listening to PreserveCast. Excited to have you back and appreciative for all the new listeners. We've had a big uptick in downloads and streams. And so if you're new to the podcast, welcome. We are going to be sitting down with a historian today to talk about a really interesting topic and one that is unique and that we haven't covered yet, of course, here on PreserveCast, which is what we try and bring you. But before we get there, make sure if you're just kind of joining us or you've found this podcast, that if you can subscribe and like it and share it. Sharing it has been a big part of kind of growing the listenership. So if you like this episode and you're so inclined, we would love for you to share it and also to rate it if you have the ability to do that. It definitely helps getting it up in the algorithm so that people can find it. Today's episode is going to be with an independent historian. We're speaking and sitting down with Anne Dobberteen, who is an independent historian that holds a PhD from George Mason. But importantly for our conversation, she was the 2025-2026 Vining Hacker Fellow in Women's Military History at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. And while she was there, she worked on a really cool project that we want to talk about. But before we get there, we're going to talk a little bit about Anne's background and what got her into this specific aspect of history. So, Anne, where are you from? Where'd you grow up? And why'd you become what you are today?
Thanks so much. I grew up in Southern California, and I spent a lot of time as a kid going to museums. My parents taking me to different places throughout the country, visiting historic sites, and I just fell in love with going to museums and going to places like Colonial Williamsburg was so cool to me as a 9-year-old. And so I'd always kind of had a love for history, read a lot of historical fiction as a kid. And then I think my AP US history teacher, shout out to Mrs. Grimshaw at Los Alamitos High School, really kind of piqued my interest in history and pushed me and inspired me. And I think it was during her class in high school that I decided I want a career in this somehow. So I decided to come to undergrad at the George Washington University here in DC because I'd heard of this thing called an internship. And I heard that you're supposed to get those as an undergrad. And so I wanted to be near all the Smithsonians, obviously, it made perfect sense in my 18-year-old brain. And so my first role as a kind of public history person was at the National Air and Space Museum as an education intern. And then throughout undergrad and into my master's program, I worked as a museum educator, kind of on a part-time basis, giving different demonstrations and shows on the floor, talking about the histories and principles of air and space flight. And I think that kind of got me interested in aviation history and the culture of aviation a little bit. And been around DC doing various public history roles ever since. And then my dissertation and postdoc have brought me back to the world of aviation history in the form of World War II air defense on the continental U.S.
So in some ways, the 18-year-old brain was correct.
Yeah.
Which is not always the case. I mean, sometimes people have a very circuitous route that we hear about here. But yours is kind of direct. I mean, you came out here to study it, you studied it, you got a really cool internship, and then that kind of led you to where... Now, did you anticipate military history being something of a focus?
Absolutely not. I kind of backed into it. In searching for aerial visual culture, aerial photographs in different archives as I was coming up with my dissertation project, I'd worked on bird's eye views in a past role. I found photographs that would turn into the inspiration for this project. And it was of women at Washington, D.C.'s Anti-Aircraft Artillery Command Center in World War II, civilian women volunteering to track the courses of aircraft on a big map so that the artillery officers and commanders would be able to make tactical decisions based on those visualizations. And I had to know what they were doing. I had to understand who these women were. And so to do that, even though they were civilians, they were volunteering for the Army. And so I had to then learn all about Army Air Forces and Army Coast Artillery air defenses. And so I really did take a circuitous route to get to the kind of war and society field that I think is so fascinating.
So you're the author of a journal article for Washington History, and it's called Flash, The Hidden Figures of DC's World War II Anti-Aircraft Artillery Command. Before we kind of get into that piece of it, talk to us about what the defense of DC looked like. Like, why did we need this? What were these women kind of walking into? And then we can kind of talk about the service. But like, you know, you hear a lot about the defense of DC or the defenses of DC, perhaps during the Civil War. Some of those sites are still on the landscape. Some of them are metro stops. So we hear about that. And then between the Civil War and World War II, you don't hear as much about it. But what was the defenses of DC? What did they look like at this moment? Was it pretty sparse, or what were they up against?
Well, heading into World War II, they were up against quite a lot. They didn't really have many defenses, certainly very few modern defenses in place. And there's another challenge in terms of unity of command. The military district of Washington as its own kind of command is actually, the modern version is sort of a product of World War II. So heading into the war, it was a bit more complicated to make tactical decisions, to make defensive decisions and execute them to defend the city because there were different entities involved. It was not all under one command. So in May of 42, that's when we get the military district of Washington created. And it was to do two things: tactical air defense with a lot of anti-aircraft artillery guns staffed by Coast Artillery soldiers, and also to do various protection of different sites around the city, to do ceremonial activities, much like a lot of military, like the military bands and stuff would do today. So it was sort of a two-pronged thing, but I'm interested mostly in the aircraft defenses. And so what that came to look like at its peak, which was in kind of August, September of 43, is rings of searchlights, spotter stations, anti-aircraft artillery guns ringing the city, like big 90 millimeter guns, which were kind of the most modern ones of the day. And radar was used to aim them. So there were radar units around the city as well. And then when you got farther in, there were smaller anti-aircraft and machine guns on top of certain buildings within the city.
And I mean, I think one challenge sort of looking back on history sometimes is that we sort of have this modern, you know, looking back, we have 2020 vision. We know that, you know, there wasn't a giant aerial assault on Washington, D.C. How real was the threat to them at the time? How realistic was it that this could happen? Were they generally concerned? And were there any, like, I really want to dig into the aspect and, you know, want to kind of uncover these hidden figures that you've focused on. But I'm curious, like, about just like the scale of the threat, and did they ever come in contact with anything enemy related?
I think that it would depend on who you asked. I think there was varying opinions. I think that a lot of civilians we're very aware that there's a big Atlantic Ocean between Washington, D.C. and Europe, and we're not very concerned. But the thinking among the Anti-Aircraft Artillery Command was that it was possible, if remote, that the East Coast cities, especially DC, especially New York, especially Boston, even Norfolk, might see some targeted, quote unquote, suicide raids. So one-way attacks, not so much designed to really, shatter industries and infrastructure, but as kind of a morale hit.
Right.
And so that was a concern. Not a huge concern. Looking back, of course, the Germans did not have big aircraft carriers. An attack would have been difficult, but concerns about launching, reported long-range bombers that, maybe they were in development. Who knows? It's 1942. We're not sure. From somewhere like the Azores or somewhere like Greenland or somewhere in Latin America, that seemed feasible. And so rather than be caught unprepared for some kind of attack and to make the populace feel safe and feel secure and feel like their skies were being guarded and their cities were protected, it was important to put these things in place. Hindsight, it looks a lot like security theater, but that's not necessarily a bad thing if it kept people calm on the home front. And so that's kind of what they were doing. What was the second part?
I was just curious, was there ever any effort to penetrate the system?
Oh, was there? Aerially on the East Coast, no, but the Battle of the Atlantic saw a lot of engagement right off the Atlantic coast of Nazi submarines attacking merchant marine shipping right off the coast. And so you get things like coastal dim outs where coastal communities are told to turn off their lights because they were backlighting American shipping and making it very easy for the Germans to take them down early in the war. And so I think that proximity was very much on people's minds, especially early in the war. One oral history that I read of a woman who lived in Tacoma Park, Maryland, right outside of DC, said she remembered thinking, well, the Nazis are right off Rehoboth. What's next? Let's follow the blackout orders. Let's just do what the Army and civil defense people are telling us because we don't know. And I think that's more on people's minds then than we give them credit for now.
Yeah, I think that, again, that's sort of like that. That's helpful to kind of give it that contemporary context. So the aircraft warning service is established. You threw that out there. And then what's, I think, perhaps interesting is as the title leads, that there's these hidden figures behind it. And obviously your interest in this intersection of women's military history, it's not an obvious jump that women would be part of this. Explain to us how that happens, how the military comes to that decision, and how do they recruit for it? Who gets selected? Who are these women that help, and how big of a role do they play in supporting this system in DC and elsewhere?
Well, the role that they play is very important. And I call them the hidden figures because they often worked in secret locations that were not visible to the public. So they were doing work that they were told not to talk about. And so they were visually kind of obscured. They were reported on in the newspaper. People were like aware of them, but it's hard for historians to see them or understand them in the archive. So this whole aircraft warning service system was essentially an early warning system of civilian ground observers on both coasts and along the Gulf Coast, whose job it was to watch for planes and listen for them and telephone them in to these centralized locations called filter centers, where women would answer the phone and they would hear the report of where this plane was. They would make a special marker for it and put it on a special map board that showed kind of their local and regional airspace.
Now, where was that work being done where they're putting this on the board? Is this in an indiscreet bunker somewhere? Or?
Not as much as you would think. There in Baltimore, they rented some floor space in the Standard Oil building, which is still there as apartment buildings. Yeah. What the Army did was look for sturdy kind of steel frame buildings that would stand a better chance in, surviving bombardment should it come to that. And they would rent floor space. On the West Coast, I just read that the Elks Lodge building in Sacramento was one site. A Masonic temple in another West Coast city was another point. So a lot of these kind of big early skyscraper or just really sturdy buildings is where these women would have been taking the phone calls from the observers. And so from there, that information would have been kind of checked and double checked against more reports. And then a new bigger stand to really represent a confirmed flight would be put on the board. That data would be relayed by another woman with a telephone connection to a bigger information center for their region, would have remapped all of the data from that one filter center and nearby one. So there's this big complete picture of a region's airspace for the Army Air Force's wing commander to watch and be ready to initiate tactical action, active defenses. So like calling up pursuit planes to meet an enemy, activating anti-aircraft artillery like the one in DC, and initiating a blackout and things like that. So that's kind of an overview of what these women were doing.
Now, can I just jump in? Were they putting every plane on this? Like, they're putting civilian ones on. So they were actively doing this part, like, because there are planes in the air. There just aren't German Nazi planes in the air. So they're doing that. They're
pretty much putting every plane that's seen or heard on the board. There's a point when they're pushing the observers to be able to identify the planes a little bit later in the war, where at certain places with really busy airspace like DC and Philadelphia, they're instructed not to call in certain obviously friendly planes because they were gumming up the phone lines and causing a lot more stress on the telephone system. But no, they would generally report every plane seen or heard overhead. And it was quite helpful when someone got lost, like an Army or Navy trainer got lost or crashed even, because they would know exactly where it was. They didn't have the kind of transponder equipment that we know today. And so sometimes this intelligence that these women were getting handed by ground observers was the best way to locate someone who was lost and either help them land safely or send out first responders if need be. But you'd asked how the women were recruited and who they were. So to jump back to that, they were really looking for women who either had time to spare during the day, perhaps a housewife or a woman who was of the upper class who didn't really have to work, to take a couple of shifts a week during the day. Shifts were usually about 4 hours during the day. Nighttime shifts were a bit longer and maybe a little bit less frequent, but oftentimes in DC, at least, professional women who had white collar jobs in the city took those all night shifts because they wanted to be part of this defense as well. So what you get is a broad swath of kind of socioeconomic and professional women. And you also get men serving as ground observers who are kind of outside the draft age. A lot of World War I vets who are in the American Legion get involved. Youths get involved. So it's a pretty diverse group in so much as you've got different ages and kind of different groups of people. It's not as racially diverse or ethnically diverse as we might have hoped for. It was a lot of white folks. That's not to say that people of color were not involved, but it was a majority kind of white thing based on local customs. A lot of places still had segregation in effect and things of that nature.
And it was paid work too, though, right?
It was volunteer.
It was volunteer. So they were not enlisted. This was volunteer. So this is similar, I guess, in some ways to the air raid warden kind of system, but more, but they were under the supervision of the military.
Yeah. So it's this weird gray area of these super militarized civilians who kind of have to, adhere to Army policies. In some cases, go through background and fingerprint checks to make sure that, they're okay to serve. And it's a gray area because, how do you discipline a civilian who's working under the Army but is not military? And this kind of they ran into a few problems with this, especially with the ground observers who, are being asked to drive to these remote observation posts and spend hours and, maybe not even see a plane, but they've burned up their gas and tire rations in the process. And so there's a little bit of friction that happens. Ultimately, they get approval for more gas rations. But I think that the thing to remember is that the Army is kind of shorthanded. They don't want to have to deploy soldiers for this home defense because they're not thinking that the possibility of attack is really pressing. So by using civilian labor, they're cutting costs. You don't have to billet soldiers who would be serving at a post if you have civilians doing it. And the same thing with the women at the filter and information centers. Now, on the East Coast, for a time, they did try to employ Army WACs to do this work. They kind of based the whole system off of the British Dowding system and their air defense system, which did use women who were kind of part of their military. And so it seemed a good thing.
But it was also a heavily engaged system. It was a very, ours, you said arguably security theater, but it made people feel comfortable. There's anything but security theater. I mean, it was engaged heavily for years. So.
Exactly. But that was the model that the United States based this whole thing off of.
Right. And for people who are listening who aren't familiar, you use the acronym WACS. Can you tell a little people about what that is and how that was different from this?
Yeah, so that was the Women's Army Corps, and that was the first sort of branch that women were allowed to enlist in significant numbers in World War II. And so initially they are brought in to, support the war effort and to release soldiers from doing things like clerical work, doing things like plotting aircraft on these boards, because signal corpsmen and aircraft warning service units of men had been doing this work and would do this work overseas in the field. And so this kind of all fell in line with what the WACs were being asked to do, which is to replace men to do more active combat. The problem was that they'd already gotten these civilian volunteer women engaged in this volunteer work at these centers on the East Coast. And so it was kind of a mess when the Army Air Forces says, okay, thanks, civilian women. Great job. We're actually bringing in WACs. Well, the WACs are kind of looking around saying, wait, we're replacing a civilian housewife? This isn't what we signed up for.
Right.
And there's a lot of tension. Nobody's happy. And eventually they get pulled out and reassigned in most cases. Some of these companies of WACs did stay on longer. Like in DC, there was the 62nd WAC Aircraft Warning Service unit. And they worked on the anti-aircraft artillery board. And there wasn't as much friction with that kind of anti-aircraft board that was in DC and other places too, as there was with the bigger aircraft warning service centers. For whatever reason, I think the staffing needs were just a little bit different.
So I think someone listening to this, I mean, there are a couple sort of follow-ups to this. What does this tell us about history? Like, why is it so interesting to you? What is the sort of the value to better understanding this story in 2026? How does this sort of, where does this fall within the history of aircraft and women in the military? And what are the sort of the lessons from this, do you feel like?
I think that a lot of people have forgotten that this kind of first national air defense system existed because it wasn't really needed. A lot of people remember more Cold War defenses when thinking back about the history of air defense, but no, women were playing central roles in the nation's air defense in World War II. And I think it's important to highlight their service as an important component of the Homefront experience.
Right.
As part of a bigger cultural moment of kind of plane watching and plane spotting and this enthusiasm for all things aviation related, even in a defense capacity. And I think it's also important to highlight that they were serving the military, not as enlisted necessarily, but as we question or hear some leaders question what the role of women in the service is these days, this is not new. We've had women serving in these sort of national defense roles for a long time, and that's important to take away.
Yeah, some 80 years of or longer of service. And really, I mean, it stretches even further back. They weren't always enlisted, but I mean, you look at Washington's army, there were women with the army serving critical roles, keeping the army moving. So yeah, it's an interesting interplay. And you're right, they're hidden, but they certainly were playing a role. Speaking of hidden, like I work in Baltimore. I wasn't aware that the Standard Oil building had one of these spaces in it. Curious if it's even marked. Or referenced in its National Register nomination, a whole sort of just different preservation tools and components that could be brought to bear to tell that story better. How many of these places have they ever been put on a map for the DC area, and how many of them still exist? Or is there any place where you can go and really kind of dig into the story in a physical way? Is there a place where you can do the flash and be a part of that experience, or is this more ephemeral?
Unfortunately, it's more ephemeral. Not a lot of the observation posts were built to last. A lot of them were like repurposed outhouses, buses, little posts on people's roofs.
And when you say outhouses, how far out did these go from DC? I mean, I think that might be something helpful for people to understand. I mean, these went how many miles out from DC?
Oh, it was a whole chain and network up and down the whole coast. So it was all part of the active air defense zone. And I want to say about 100 miles inland.
Wow.
So yeah, it was
the
part of the
scale is immense.
Yeah.
And the numbers of sites would be then in the hundreds, if not thousands.
Thousands.
And what about the scale of the number of women involved? I don't think we asked that question.
It's a really good question. It wasn't actually a nationally organized and unified program. The East and West Coasts were kind of doing the same thing, but under separate commands, separate Army commands. And we don't actually have those numbers. But I do know that over 700,000 people participated in this nationwide. And that's just the aircraft warning service. That's not even the Coast Artillery volunteers like the ones in DC. But I think that probably over half of them were women.
That's I mean, that's a huge number when you think about the scale of the number of soldiers who were engaged, and just this big aspect of the home front that largely has gone overlooked. Has there ever been an effort, kind of coming back to that preservation piece? I mean, you said they're kind of, you agreed with the sense that they're sort of ephemeral, or that some of them still exist, but there's no recognition of them. Is there any uniform central database that's being developed or was developed or exists out there that puts them all on the map so that we could overlay that period versus the current period and see if any of those buildings still line up?
Not a huge one. I know that someone did that for the Washington State and I believe Oregon, and I can send you a link to that for the show notes. But no, there really hasn't been much work like that done. I'm working on a manuscript about the aircraft warning service, and I hope to have some kind of visualization, at least for the filter and information centers, about where those were. And that's a lot easier to track because there were fewer of them. And like I said, those are in kind of bigger buildings. A lot of them are still there. I will say also that a lot of U.S. Forest Service towers that were already in existence were used for this as well. So it's possible that some of those are still in existence. I know that one aircraft warning service observation post in Oregon is on the National Register of Historic Places, though I believe it's on private property. So I'm not sure it's accessible to the public.
Right.
So it's really kind of putting the pieces together using the ephemera that is in collections like the National Air and Space Museum. And
that's what I was going to ask then, is sort of a follow-up to that, is that because the physical space is so challenging to access and that it's kind of it's difficult to piece that all back together where these all were and whether or not they exist. What do the records look like? I mean, we know what the records of enlisted soldiers look like, for example. What do the records look like for unenlisted, unpaid volunteers for this nationwide system that obviously had a huge impact in DC, and we kind of focused in on that initially. But as you say, this maybe 700,000 people involved in the whole thing nationally. Where are the records for all of that?
That is one of my big challenges. Sort of starting at the local level, there are a few local historical societies and state archives that do have some great records. It varies by state. And so that is one place to find like logbooks of the planes that the observers called in, names of people who served, how many hours they served, and things like that. And then kind of looking through newspaper coverage is one way. The National Archives has a good amount of Army Air Force's records from earlier in the war. Maxwell Field in Alabama also has a lot of that kind of Air Force history. And then kind of like national spots like the National Air and Space Museum's archive collected a lot of the ephemera. So some of the newsy magazines that the 1st Fighter Command on the East Coast put out to motivate their volunteers, and has a lot of fun visuals and information. And armbands, award pins that volunteers were given for so many hours served are also in kind of military and aeronautic history collections, also available on eBay. You can get a lot of this ephemera on eBay. So that's another thing that I do, is kind of look at what is available on those sites to get at that material aspect of this moment. But it is a real challenge also because not everyone understands, if you're an archivist at your local or regional archive and you're not familiar with this area, you might think that these volunteers are Office of Civilian Defense and file them under that. Well, that's not right, but you don't know. And it makes it doubly hard for researchers who have to then figure out what other multiple terms and how else could someone who doesn't fully understand this obscure moment in our air defense history have filed their local story. And so it's a challenge, but
I think it's helpful to hear that, because it's also kind of paints a picture of the differences and challenges of doing women's military history research versus male military history research, because they're just two totally different systems set up very differently, depending on what kind of records you're trying to get at. Where this is sort of more decentralized record keeping. Than you might come to expect if you were trying to go after the Army Air Corps or something like that. We're talking about this at an interesting time, in that the nation is quickly approaching the 250th anniversary of American independence. How do stories like this fit into the 250th? How do you hope to see them recognized, remembered, elevated? And are you personally trying to do anything around this for the 250th?
I'm not personally trying to do anything around it for the 250th. I think that this story is important and needs to be told, regardless of what anniversary or what year it is. And so I'm working to do just that. And as I said, I'm trying to get a book manuscript together to share this story. And so for me, doing work to share these civilian men and women's roles in that early air defense system is my mission. I'm super excited about it. More broadly, I think that folks working in historic preservation and museums and archives and libraries and as historians, there's important stories to tell for the 250th, certainly. But the most important thing, I think, is just keep doing the work, keep doing the preservation, keep telling the stories that matter to you and to your community. That's the best way to honor the 250th, in my opinion.
I love that. I think it's helpful because it also sometimes feels like you're trying to like boil the ocean when it comes to the 250th. There's so much around this. And, I think a lot of us kind of feel the same way, or we feel like at least it's an opportunity to get people excited about history and be aware of this long unfolding story that is American independence and the nation itself. Before we go, we love to talk to people like you about where your favorite historic place or site is. So do you have a favorite place? I said to you before we hit record that DC runs thick through your experiences, your stories. You were a native child of California, as you told us, but you probably are now a full-fledged adopted daughter of the district because you've had so many cool district experiences. But it doesn't have to be a district site. But I'm just curious, where does your allegiance lie when it comes to your favorite historic place?
Oh boy, it's hard to choose. I guess I'll say two. Yes, I'm kind of an adopted daughter of DC at this point.
Yeah.
And I really love the Hierarch House Museum in Washington, D.C. in the DuPont Circle neighborhood. I worked there in a variety of roles kind of during the pandemic period, actually. And this is a historic house museum. It was built by German immigrant and successful beer brewer Christian Hierarch. And I love the way that the team there tells not only his immigrant story, but really centers the women involved, the craftspeople who built the house, the staff who worked there, the children, in their interpretation, and how they utilize their wonderful backyard space as a beer garden to serve revived historic brews, particularly of the Hierarch Brewing Company's Senate Lager beer, which they've restored, and you can get what that tasted like. The brewery closed in the 50s, so it's really exciting to be able to kind of taste that. And beyond that, that museum shows how you can be relevant as a historic house museum in the modern day. They also, support the community and small businesses and artisans in really meaningful ways. So shout out to them. Another place that I like that's more related to my research is kind of the Bethany Beach area in Delaware, because anti-aircraft artillery soldiers who were stationed in DC would go there to do target practice into the ocean.
Wow.
Including some women who were stationed as part of a mixed gender experiment to see if men and women could, work on a gun crew together. Scandalous. And
where was that happening? I mean, there's a lot of listeners. We have listeners all over the world, for that matter, but a lot of listeners concentrated in the DMV, and people are familiar with Ocean City and Bethany and places like that, and might make their way there this summer. Where in Bethany did a lot of that happen? Were they just kind of on the beach shooting off into the distance? Or you're nodding yes.
Yeah, they were shooting at targets towed by an aircraft over the ocean, and they weren't stationed there permanently. They were stationed. These particular women in this experiment, known also as Battery X, were stationed around DC at the National Arboretum, at Camp Sims, and at Bowling, and they did extensive training and worked with male Coast Artillery soldiers right around the district. It was very, very secret, and what they were doing was very concealed because not everyone was ready to accept women in anti-aircraft units in that way yet, both civilians in the public and even in the military. But that's another kind of fun piece of this. And so going to the beach in Delaware makes me remember them executing the test of target practice successfully.
Well, that sounds like another good future journal article there, maybe the Journal of Delaware History or something like that. But that's a fascinating one. Looking forward to reading the book when the manuscript is done. We'll have to have you back for that. Would love to. It's been a pleasure sitting down. Again, we've been talking with Anne Dobberteen, who holds a PhD in history from the George Mason University. She was the 2025-2026 Vining Hacker Fellow in Women's Military History at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History and is an independent historian. We are so thrilled to have her and have had a chance to sit down and talk about this interesting topic in American history. Thanks so much for joining us today, Anne.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a blast.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to preservecast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.